Okay, hello everyone. My name's Katie, and I am the head of the genealogy department here at Midland County Public Libraries. And today I am going to share with you some information about the graveyard and cemeteries and the kind of things that you need to be on the lookout for when you're doing your genealogy research. So let's begin. Okay, so you can find a whole bunch of information in a cemetery on tombstones, maybe where they're placed in a cemetery, their location in the state of their grave. Of course, everyone knows that you can find a name and possibly a birth and death date. Some really important information, though, that kind of goes underlooked or overlooked is the relation. So maybe they've got other people buried in plots next to them, and it might be listed on their tombstones whether they're related or not to your ancestors. Military service, that's pretty much always listed on a tombstone, whether by an icon or whether it says explicitly private or sergeant of uh, whatever battalion. And then religious affiliation as well as different groups. So, there are all different types of symbols that you can find, and of course, the most obvious is probably the religious affiliation. Of course, pretty much everyone recognizes the cross or the Star of David, and even the crescent and star for people who are Muslim. And then there's other things that can kind of look a little bit foreign. There is the Russian Orthodox Church, which is awesome because if you find that, you know that they're from Russia. There's also a Greek cross, so you know that they're Greek. Or your Native American Church of North America. So those are all different symbols that you can find regarding the religious affiliation. Depending on the variation, of course, specifically of the cross, uh, you can kind of determine where they came from. Okay, so going on about symbols that you find on a headstone, animals are pretty popular. I would say the dove is the most popular, birds in flight. So these all mean different things. And you can kind of discern what they mean for yourself. For example, dogs. Dogs are always known as man's best friend, so it's a sign of loyalty. Um, there is one probably not so common is a butterfly. So butterflies are typically common on Celtic graves because there is an Irish saying that goes, butterflies are souls of the dead waiting to pass through purgatory. So, the butterfly, there's the whole symbolism of starting life as a caterpillar and going through metamorphosis and taking its final form, which is a butterfly. And that's kind of the same thing when it comes to life that they want to depict on their headstone. There are, of course, angels. There's angels of grief, like this statue in the lower left corner, which is a famous statue. There is angels carrying a soul, angels flying. There's frequently cherubs. You'll just see a face of a cherub with wings behind it. And that's kind of a different iteration of an earlier Puritan symbol, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Body parts. So mainly hands. There are different hand symbols. You'll often see hands being clasped, which means a marriage typically, or hands holding something, maybe a hand holding a heart. Hands praying, you can discern that means that they were pretty devoted to their religious organization. Now, this really interesting one that I discovered when researching this was two hands touching at the thumb, kind of like Spock when he does his mind meld and he puts his hands together. That's what this is, and it's a Jewish symbol, and it's typically on Jewish graves. Okay, and then there is the heart. Of course, the heart can be passion, it can be love. Maybe if someone was very caring in their time or was pretty passionate about their religion, then that's a common symbol. So these are all just little bits and pieces to give us more context into who our ancestors were as people, because you can do genealogy just to get as far back as possible, or you could do genealogy to fill in the stories of your ancestors and tell the story of your family. So this is all supplemental information. Okay, now there's geometry that you can find on your gravestones. Of course, there's circle for never-ending life. Some really interesting ones that I found were a pyramid. So if you have a pyramid, or if your headstone is in the shape of a pyramid, it used to be believed that this was to prevent the devil from reclining on your grave. You would think if he's that determined to recline on a grave, maybe a pyramid wouldn't stop him, but I can see it's not a very comfortable seat. So that's where that comes from. There's also a pentagram. So when you typically look at a pentagram now, it's pretty much used for people who practice Wicca, or an upside down pentagram could be someone who is part of the Freemasons. So pentagrams used to be, if you are in a very old cemetery, used to be for magicians and sorcerers in the Middle Ages. And then it kind of evolved into a symbol suggesting the five wounds of Christ. And so now, of course, it can be used for both Christianity and Wicca. Okay, and then objects. There's stuff like an anchor, which might symbolize the nature of a person's character, like they're strong, they're steadfast, they're never wielding. And then there's, of course, more practical thing like an anvil or a hammer or something like that, which might suggest what they did in life. For example, a book open could mean that they were a scholar, or it could mean that they were a priest or some person in the church. And then, of course, the most popular one is a skull. So there's all different iterations of that. That can be a skull with crossbones. It can be a skull with wings, and that's often called the death's head. So there's stars, the sun. The sun, if you see that on a grave, it's the rising and setting of new life. An urn, which is another popular one, especially combined with a willow tree. An urn just means the body is turning back to ashes and dust. Okay, and lastly, plants are a pretty important part, pretty frequently found in a grave site. As I just mentioned, the willow tree with the urn is a popular combination. The willow tree meaning mourning. It's a pretty sad tree, so it makes sense. Another one would be like a rose. So frequently on graves, you'll see roses either intact or broken. So if a rose is intact, it typically means, they were very loving, very wise, very beautiful. But if a rose is broken, that typically means that a wonderful life was cut too short. So they probably died a little too early, their family feels. Okay, so let's get into some historical context. So it used to be and now we are talking about kind of early American colonial years. So in colonial times, when the Puritans came over, there was not, death was not such a big thing that it is now. It was common. They acknowledged it as a part of life, and they didn't really see it as all that special. So they would set aside, some piece of land that they can't use for farming. So if it was rocky, uneven, if you can't build on it, if you can't use it in some practical way, that's where you're putting your dead bodies. So that was kind of the foresight that they had there, which can obviously lead to some issues if you're digging a grave and you have to move a whole bunch of rocks. That's kind of an unfun job, so maybe you didn't dig that deep. Or if it rained and the rocky soil comes loose, then you might end up with your Uncle Tom over there underneath a tree. So that was kind of an early Puritan mindset. They didn't really use any fancy headstones. They kind of just used wooden markers or like a stone. And then they started to use iconography, like the death's head that you see here. So this was kind of a reflection of the religious landscape in colonial times. Puritans, as I said before, were very unaffected by death. It was just a matter of a fact, a matter of life. They kind of viewed it as an extra opportunity to push salvation and emphasize that death is always coming. So, they didn't really seek a whole bunch of comfort in it or long to seek a whole bunch of comfort in it. And then throughout the years in the 1800s, people started to get a little tired of the harsh skulls and funeral sentiments. So they started incorporating a bit softer iconography and started focusing on memorial and peace in death, and not so much the salvation and what happens after. So it's kind of evolved. You can see here the difference. So we've got a modern memorial park as opposed to a burial ground where everything is kept pretty beautiful. Families now, they want to focus on the life of the deceased person, and that can help in a way the genealogist. And then there's even, if you look in the bottom right, there are even green burial parks. So that's kind of, it makes it a little bit difficult because there's rarely any markers, but it's kind of a return to making sure that it's not something that lasts forever, that it's just temporary. Okay, so now we're going to get into the topic of grave rubbing. Grave rubbing is kind of a controversial practice, but it's been practiced for centuries. What you do is you get a big piece of paper, a newspaper, butcher paper, art paper, and you tape it to a grave that you want to memorialize. And then you get a charcoal or like a soft graphite pencil, and you just gently go over the gravestone, and it leaves an imprint pretty similar to this. This in the right, on the right side, that is taken from a knight's grave. So that's a rubbing from a knight's grave. Now there are some issues when it comes to grave rubbing. So it can cause damage to headstones, especially very old headstones. They were typically made out of softer materials because they had to use what was available locally. So if centuries and centuries of grave rubbing on a headstone will erode it and make it impossible to read. It is banned in some states. So if you want to go out and grave rub on maybe your ancestors or a really cool looking grave, make sure that you pay attention to the laws in your state. And then, of course, you can always take a picture, right? But people that really like grave rubbing say that there are valid reasons for doing it. Like it's cool and unique. You have a life-sized reproduction, and they say that sometimes it can even come out better than a photoshopped image. So if you're having trouble reading a gravestone, that might be an alternative for you. Other people describe it as a spiritual experience, a way to get closer to your ancestors or the deceased, which I guess you can kind of see the pros and cons of both of these things. But just make sure to follow the law, so check that first. Okay, and lastly, we're going to talk about death records. So, death records are super important when it comes to doing genealogy, but they're super hard to get when it comes to some parts of the United States. So, most of the United States didn't require records until the 19th century. So, for example, Texas, I think it was maybe 1880, but somewhere between 1850 and 1880, you'll start to notice an increase in the number of available death records. And then, of course, we keep them now. So, if it was perhaps in the last century that you're looking for a death record, then you can go to the State Department of Vital Records, and you can apply for a copy of that death certificate. It does cost a fee, but it might be worth it when it comes to your research. So, of course, areas of New England, the original colonies, kept records longer. The only thing is you may have to contact the place where you know that they have died. And that goes for birth records as well. Location is very important when it comes to doing genealogy. So, other places you can get death records, you can follow Bible records or maybe some grave indexes if they fall before the mid 1800s. And here you can see all the awesome information that we have on just one death record. So you can see, of course, the name and the birth, and then the date and place of death. But you can also see what they did for a living. So airplane pilot, and how they died. So they tell you all of the nasty details, and then they say in an airplane crash. It's really helpful to look at the next of kin, so you can see the name of the father, the name of the mother, and then typically there will be a person applying to either receive a pension or to receive the death record that you can see. So signature of the informant would be the wife, and then you could see that relation there. So there's lots of good information that you can find on a death record. And here you can see a register of deaths from 1890. And this is a little less formal. There's not so much information on here, but you have a date and you have a place, and that's pretty important. And then you can also see their birthplace and nationality, and this is from Michigan in 1890. All right, and that's all we're going to talk about today. I hope you learned something, and I hope it got you in the perfect spooky mood to do some cemetery research when it comes to your genealogy ancestors. I hope you join us next time. Next month, we're going to be talking about Native American genealogy and the basics and tips and tricks to that. Okay, thanks. Have a good time.